honoured to be here in beautiful Adelaide, and a big thank you to all for putting on this gorgeous weather. Isn't it beautiful? I was saying before, I probably didn't need the thermal underwear that I've got on or the extra socks under the boots, but I'm not complaining because it's such a gorgeous day. Thank you everyone for coming. My name's Rhonda Livingston, and I work for ASEQA, the Australian Children's Education and Care Quality Authority. What a mouthful, ASEQA. And I have two roles in ASEQA. One is National Education Leader, but I also have the pleasure and privilege of being the General Manager of the Leadership Quality and Regulatory Support team. And so I work with my colleague Vanessa, who's the one of the managers in our team. And as part of that, we also have the pleasure and privilege of working with our colleagues in states and territories and the Australian government, and with the Education Standards Board in South Australia. So to start, I'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians and owners of this beautiful land, the Kaurna people. And Vanessa and I work in Sydney on the land of the Gadigal people, and it's pouring there, so we're very pleased to be here on beautiful Kaurna land. And we wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the important role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have played for more than 65,000 years in not only caring for our environment and our waterways, but also educating and nurturing children for more than 65,000 years. And we just wanted to share, many of you may have seen this beautiful video developed by the Department of Education in South Australia. But as we play this, if you could just take a moment to think about your reconciliation journey and where you are on that journey. And I just think it's an inspiring way to start our conversation this afternoon.
We acknowledge the traditional owners throughout South Australia,
and we pay respect
to the custodians
of the land on which
we live and learn.
We respect
In their spiritual,
the relationship with country
and acknowledge that their cultural
and heritage beliefs
are still as important to those living today.
we pay our respects to elders,
Past,
present and emerging.
and we acknowledge
the cultural authority
Of Aboriginal people visiting
from other areas
of South Australia
and Australia.
present here today.
Thanks, Rhonda. Hi, everybody. I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes with you today, giving you some background about how we ended up asking ASEQA to partner with us, and also just give you the opportunity to hear from me directly as the regulator before handing back for your session today. So we have a shared goal as the regulator and the providers of early childhood education and care services, and that is the safety, health and well-being of children. I have enormous respect for what you do every day and the important role that you play in educating and caring for the young South Australian citizens. In South Australia and across Australia, our shared goal is governed by the National Quality Framework. This framework, the South Australian government signed up to this state in 2012. In focus today is the NQF's objective of commitment to continuous improvement, to raising the quality and consistency of early childhood service delivery. The NQF recognises and values that each service has a unique context and community that draws upon a range of contemporary research, theory, and understanding to inform best practice. Achieving a meeting rating means that your service is providing high quality care and undertakes high quality practices. It is more challenging now than it was for a service to achieve an overall exceeding rating. In 2023, the ESB launched a new regulatory posture to give clarity and transparency to how we regulate under the NQF and what you as regulated parties can expect from us as the regulator. It is built around the 4 E's of regulation, being engage, educate, evaluate, and enforce. Our posture places emphasis on developing collaborative relationships with regulated parties and stakeholders. As the regulatory authority, our aim is to support you to achieve our shared goal and also to help you understand your regulatory obligations and responsibilities as you strive for continuous improvement. To that end, the ESB has invested in an education and guidance principal officer. This is the first time the ESB has had a role of this nature. Kristen Hyde, if you could wave, is here today. She's here to listen to the rich conversations that you have, to assist her in her role to develop our educational and guidance strategy moving forward. During engagement last year with some of you, and certainly with a large part of the sector representatives and other groups, we heard that there was a need for further clarity and support in understanding the exceeding themes and how exceeding practice is defined and assessed. Today's workshop is in response to that request. And in line with our regulatory posture, the aim of today's session is to provide you with practical and constructive information and advice to increase your understanding of exceeding themes and to support you to achieve an exceeding rating in the future. So, I'd like to hand over to Rhonda and to Vanessa and wish you well for your workshop and look forward to hearing whether the workshop met your needs. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kerry, and thanks for taking time out of your busy day to join us. And I know that you've probably already had a busy day, and this time slot is a tough gig at the end of the day, so we want to make this as much fun as we possibly can, as much as you can with regulatory standards and national quality standards, but we would encourage you to ask questions along the way. We're really keen to hear your suggestions and ideas, but we also know that there's an awful lot of knowledge, skill, wisdom and experience in the room. Some of you have been working with the national quality standards before they were even born. Back in the day when I had brown hair and much less junk in my trunk, if you remember. Back in the day. So we want to draw on that knowledge and wisdom, and we want to have lots of opportunities for conversation at your tables and across the room, because the reality is you know your children and your families and your communities better than anybody else, and the National Quality Framework, and particularly the National Quality Standard, is about empowering you to demonstrate how you're meeting those standards in a way that's relevant for your context. And we'll keep coming back to the context, because it's so important, because we don't want a service in Uluru to look like one in CBD Adelaide or to look like one on the Torres Strait. So context is really important. And what we thought we would try and fit into our time together today is give you an overview of the exceeding NQS, and also deepen your understanding in terms of high quality practices, but also we wanted to unpack those 3 exceeding themes in more detail and give you some of the information in terms of the background, how they were developed, and build your understanding of the exceeding practices across all of the national quality standards, so that you can confidently articulate and demonstrate those high quality practices, not only as part of the assessment and rating, because that's only one part, but when you're having conversations with your service team, but also with your families and with others. And as I said, we know there's a lot of knowledge, experience, wisdom, skill in the room, but could I just get a show of hands? If you've been working in a service that is under the National Quality Framework for less than 12 months, can you please put your hands up? Less than 12 months? No one? More than 12 months, but less than 5 years. Great, thank you. Some new fresh eyes. More than 5 years, but less than 10 years. Fantastic, thank you. And more than 10 years. Well done. What a rich array we've got across the group this afternoon. And we're really excited about, as I said, hearing your thoughts and suggestions and ideas, and also some of the practices from your services. I think it really adds richness to the conversation. And as you well know, the National Quality Framework was introduced way back in 2012. Seems like only yesterday, but it's more than a decade ago. And it provides that national approach to regulation, assessment and quality improvement for education and care sector, our sector. And it includes a national law and a national regulation. So they set the minimum foundation in terms of those minimum legal requirements that we must meet. Then there's the National Quality Standard that builds on that strong foundation of the law and the regulation, but it also has a focus on quality outcomes for children. So you'll notice that the National Quality Standard is not prescriptive, as having been involved in the development of the National Quality Standard, and people across the room were part of that consultation process. As much as possible, we tried to focus on outcomes in the National Quality Standard. And then, of course, there's the assessment and rating process that sits on top of that, and regulatory officers will assess the level in terms of the 5-tiered rating scale, but also while they're doing that, they're also mindful of compliance with the minimum regulatory standards. That's always been part of the process. And then there's the approved learning frameworks, the Belonging, Being, Becoming early years learning framework, and the My Time, Our Place framework for school age care. And they've been in force for more than a decade. And recently, many of you might have been involved in the consultation process, the rich consultation that happened around the refresh. A consortium of academics from across Australia were brought together, and leaders, key thinkers and sector representatives were involved in a refresh of those frameworks. It was determined from feedback from the sector that they were still fit for purpose, but they just needed a refresh. And thank you to everyone who contributed to that process, because it was a very robust process and included the voices of children and educators. And as of the 1st of February this year, of course, those new frameworks, version 2 of those frameworks, was embedded into the legislation. So you had more than a year just to get your head around the changes and the strengthening of some of those practices in the frameworks. And I think one of the other strengths of the National Quality Standard is that it's given us a shared language for discussing evidence and for discussing practice, and also for talking about outcomes and keeping them focused. And it's about empowering educators and service leaders to demonstrate, as I said, demonstrate how those standards are met in a way that's relevant for your context, that's genuine and authentic. It's relevant for the children and families and the educators and service leaders and the community in which your service is located. So, in response to requests from the sector about the exceeding requirements, back in 2018, a panel of academics, of service leaders and skilled assessors came together, and they were invited to identify the common themes that they saw in practices that were happening across Australia in Services. And from that, they developed 3 themes that we're going to unpack in more detail. And they helped us develop some additional guidance to unpack and understand those themes. And we're going to showcase some of the rich array of resources that are available to support you and your teams understand and implement practice that is at that exceeding level. And just recently, for the first time, I look really old, but for the first time in my working career, I took some long service leave and I got to go to the ACERA conference, the European Early Childhood Research Association conference in Lisbon. And we were joined by some of the academics on the consortium, and we were showcasing the changes that had happened to the approved learning frameworks and the process. And excitingly for me, someone in the back of the session stood up and said, I think Australia is 20 years ahead of the rest of the world in terms of practice and the frameworks. So I just want to call out all of you because Australia is now being internationally recognised, and as a result, I got an invitation to go and talk a few years ago to the Canadian government, and I was talking to Melissa in the session that we just had, and she was talking about the time that she worked in Canada and practitioners over there talking about the fact that their framework is based on the Australian framework. We've also, Gabrielle Sinclair, our CEO, has been invited to go to China and talk to the Chinese government and Chinese service providers about our framework. UNICEF invited us to help Sri Lanka develop their learning framework. One of my colleagues went to Brazil as a part of a request to help them in that space. When I worked in an education department in a previous life, I was fortunate enough to get a Director General's bursary and got to go and spend time with the Education Review Office in New Zealand. And a couple of years ago, they came and spent time with us because they can see that they have some opportunities to learn from our framework as well. And also South Korea has reached out for some help. So the National Quality Framework is an internationally recognised framework, and that wouldn't be the case if it wasn't for the hard work of each and every educator and service leader and approved provider throughout Australia. So thank you. And in the spirit of continual quality improvement, as Kerry said, that's one of the guiding principles of the National Quality Framework. In the spirit of continual quality improvement, ministers have agreed to continual improvements to the National Quality Framework. The standards have been improved and streamlined, and guidance has been improved as well. I mentioned the 2 reviews of the approved learning frameworks, but some of you will be aware of the outcomes of the last review of the NQF, and there were some legislative changes in response to practice and some issues emerging in the sector. And that process of continual improvement is happening at a state and territory level with the Australian government, and ACEQA collaborates in that process. And as you all would be aware, I know I'm preaching to the converted, but you would be all aware that under the national law, services must deliver an educational program to all children being educated and cared for that's based on an approved learning framework. And I understand that if some of you are working in a school context, maybe in outside school hours care services or preschools, that alignment with the school environment as well. But I wanted to, at this time of the afternoon, it's nice to have a bit of a movie. I'm sorry we haven't got popcorn, but I just wanted to share a video It was developed in 2018, and it's Dr. Jennifer Cartmel from Griffith University and Professor Jennifer Sumption from Charles Sturt University, and they were part of the consortium of academics who worked with service leaders and sector leaders to develop the themes. They do talk about new guidance, but I do think the guidance that they offer is still relevant in 2024. And when you're watching this video, if you could take a moment just to jot down things that resonate for you in this conversation. And then we'll come back after watching the video and have a little group discussion about things that resonate and invite you to share that with the broader group. So, over to Jennifer and Jennifer.
And go. There we go. No.
Welcome to our discussion on the new guidance for the Exceeding National Quality Standard. I'm Dr. Jennifer Cartmel from Griffith University, and I'm with Professor Jennifer Sumption from Charles Sturt University. Jennifer and I work closely with government, ASEQA, and sector experts to develop the criteria for exceeding. This criteria will help explain for education and care services what it really means to exceed practice in the sector. The exceeding criteria really means to go above and beyond just meeting the standards. And I think that we've got a lovely good examples that we're able to use. You know, when the government, ASEQA and the sector experts were together with us, it was exciting to hear about the different descriptions that people had about what exceeding looked like in family daycare, outside school hours care and long day care. And I think that the richness of those discussions around what exceeding looked like really inspired us to think about what kind of criteria really we could share with others to help us understand what going above and beyond, you know, not just meeting standards could actually look like.
And another thing that's really exciting is that the guidance for those themes have come from the terrific practice of high quality services from all around Australia. So we can have a lot of confidence that they're meaningful themes. And of course they've also been reinforced by the research literature as well.
Get your hands. Put that one down there. And roll
Things are done with such intentionality when you embed things, and I think that thinking is really important, that everybody contributes and understands why certain practices occur in a certain way. So I think embedding not only is about your practices, but it's about the thinking that people have around the practices, having a continuity and a connection between everyone as they work together.
When services are thinking about embedded practice and how they might articulate that, I think one of the important things for them to do is to think about how their service philosophy might play out and how the service philosophy connects with the standards and also with policies and procedures and the approved learning framework. So there's a lot of tying together of different threads, but services can do that. They can weave those together in a way that feels right for them and enables them to work towards what it is that they're particularly wanting to achieve.
I'm pretty passionate that critical reflection or that practice is informed by critical reflection. That's something that I'm very interested in. And I'm really interested in that members of your staff team come together to actually think about why and how you do things, what underpins your the ways of doing things, that you're just not taking things for granted. I was going to say that critical reflection really, you can occur individually and you can think about processes and reflect on what's happening for yourself. But even more, it's important for you as your staff team to actually engage in critical reflection, having those conversations about why you're doing things, how you feel about them, where you're drawing your ideas from to actually inform, and you discussed that before, inform your practice is really important. And then as a staff team, thinking about how you use that information to move forward is really, really important. And when people actually engage in critical reflection around the practices and think more deeply about what they're doing, they are really exceeding their practices and their processes to make sure that they are offering the best possible experiences for children and families.
Critical reflection can be really rewarding to engage in, but I think we both know that it's not necessarily a comfortable process, not all the time, because it involves, in many cases, robust discussion, talking through points of disagreement that can become uncomfortable. And so that's why it's really important that it's based on real trust, collegiality, respect for different points of view. I don't think you can have critical reflection unless you feel confident that your service can offer that basis of trust for those really honest discussions.
And that's where I see theme 1 around that embedding of the processes and the practice, and also that meaningful engagement with colleagues and family and the wider community. That's drawn into theme 2 when you talk about building that community of trust so that you can actually engage in critical reflection. It really is hard to separate the themes into discrete parts, though we need to talk about them each as discrete parts just to understand them in more depth. But understanding them discretely and joining them together is a really important part of this process.
Shall we move on and talk about theme 3, that practice is shaped by meaningful engagement in families and or the community?
Yes, I think that theme is really important because you actually need that critical reflection. You need that engagement to actually kind of bounce off. You know, your own identity as a service is perceived through that connection with families.
Yes, so for me, meaningful engagement certainly means respect and recognition for families, that they really are the primary people involved, or they're the most important people in terms of nurturing children's learning and development and well-being. So it's so important that as educators we build really respectful and responsive and reciprocal relationships, because it's only through those kinds of relationships that we're really going to be able to understand the hopes and aspirations and priorities, and also the concerns that families and communities may have for their children.
Children are likely to feel more connected and confident in the space when there's that meaningful engagement with families and that wider community. And so when they feel confident, they're actually able to transfer the learning and the engagement that they have in that one space into other aspects of their lives.
And belonging is so important, isn't it? And I think that when families as well as children feel a sense of belonging, they're much more likely to sustain their engagement with the service. And when you have that sustained engagement and sustained relationships, that's when really terrific things can happen.
One of the exciting things about being at this point in the National Quality Standard process is that we've really built on the past, and we know that people can achieve this criteria. We've actually used people's examples of exceeding the standards to develop this criteria, and so people can also be reassured that it is very achievable for their service to aspire or to be already achieving those standards. But that notion that you need to think very carefully at an early stage about how you're going to, and plan how you're going to get there in this quality assessment process.
And to be patient and to realise that it's not something that you can do in a rush, and to know that it's going to take a lot of hard work, but to know that it will be also very exciting.
It really will be important for services to be cognizant of the exceeding criteria as they prepare for their assessment and rating visit, and as they have the conversations with authorised officers. Just knowing what the exceeding criteria is as well as the meeting criteria will be really important to their confidence to articulate their practice.
So there are so many exciting things about this new documentation, but I think the most exciting thing of all is that it's the same documentation that educators, the service providers and the authorised officers will use. So it means that people can all speak the same language, all be on the same page, and it will be so much easier to have those important conversations about what educators are seeing as important in their service and how they're working towards achieving their goals.
So, what resonated for you in that conversation? I noted a couple of things that worked for me, or really resonated for me, when Jennifer Cartmel said, one of the exciting things about being at this point in the NQS process is that we've built on the past and we know that people can achieve this criteria. And of course, she also mentioned that it was evidence-based and that it was real-world examples. And then for me, what Jennifer Sumption said about it's important to be patient as it can't be achieved in a rush. I thought that resonated for me. So if we can just take maybe 3 minutes to have a conversation at your table, something else that might have resonated for you. Thank you for sharing that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that safe space because particularly in regard to critical reflection, it is so important to have that safe space. Thank you.
So this is a long daycare environment.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that came up in the other session too, didn't it? About the people saying they thought about belonging in the context of the child, but not necessarily in the context of the family and how important that was. Thank you. And I should have mentioned, and Vanessa prompted me to mention, I didn't. We are focusing on the themes today. We have a post-it notes up here to capture some of the questions that are out of scope of the discussion. But if I could just answer that in respect to my experiences, having worked in a regulatory authority, but also I have responsibility for training authorised officers, and this presentation was pulled together from the training that we give authorised officers. So back in the day, and I was one of them, thought it was really important to have highly skilled early childhood trained people because they understood. But as time progressed, some of the authorised officers that I had most concern about in terms of their role were the ones that were the most experienced and the most qualified. And the reason for that was because they felt comfortable, and sound like I'm generalising, I'm not generalising, but there's the risk that they feel comfortable as being the expert and they've had experience, so but what we need authorised officers to do is to take off that, to be confident in their body of knowledge in terms of pedagogy, but the national quality standard, the national regulations, and make assessments based on what the law and regs and the NQS are asking for and the approved learning frameworks. And so what we're seeing, and we unpack that in our training program, and just to let you know, it is a really robust training program. They have to do weeks of going through the e-learning modules, then they come together for 4 days, then they have another webinar, then they have to sit to reliability tests. If they're not reliable, they're not able to assess and rate. That's been nationally agreed. And then every year they have another drift test to make sure that they're not drifting from what's in the law and regs, that they're not thinking, well, this is how I used to do it in my service. So more and more what we're seeing regulatory authorities move to is a mixed. Not saying that knowledge and skill isn't valuable, it's absolutely essential, but we need people who are skilled in outside school hours care, family daycare, long daycare, preschool, but we also need to have people who understand the regulatory framework that underpins it, because whilst we've focused on the assessment and rating, you can't assess and rate unless in the background, you're looking at the minimum regulatory standards. And we tried to move away from a checklist or counting toilets every time you did an assessment and rating, because if there's still the same number of toilets there, well, why would you waste time counting toilets? Why don't you focus on the quality of interactions, for example? But you still need that that knowledge in terms of the regulatory standards. So most jurisdictions are moving to having a team approach. And I guess that's what Kerry was keen for us to come and join, because this is about empowering you to know the standards, to know the exceeding themes, but also to ask the questions. If you don't think that something is a requirement in the law or the regulations or doesn't align with the National Quality Standard, and it's about empowering you to think about, and we're going to unpack the 3 ways of collecting evidence. And, we talked to authorised officers about triangulating that evidence, because you could have the best policies in the world and get ticked for that, but unless educators and service leaders understand them and are implementing them, they're not necessarily going to have the quality outcomes for children. So thinking, and we're going to really focus on that today, trying to empower educators and service leaders to think about how they're going to, what they want the regulatory officer to see, what you want to discuss, because clearly you can't see everything, and you can't see things like leadership and governance. You have to have those rich conversations. And then we purposely put documentation last, because you can have the best documentation in the world, but unless it is actually helping educators do their work and support, share information with families, etc., the risk is that it takes you away from the important work of the collaboration and interaction with children, and getting that balance right. And nowhere in the regulations does it say, how many observations you have to do. But I still get those questions. Well, how many observations? Do you need to do this? Do you need to do reflective journals? It's really empowering. And we hope that's something that you'll take away from today, is knowledge is power. And one of the strengths, I think, of the National Quality Framework, and we'll keep coming back to it, is the Guide to the National Quality Framework. It's over 600 pages long. So please, if you do get the urge to read it from cover to cover, I'd encourage you to get out more. Because it's not meant to be a document that you read from cover to cover, but it is one to dip in and out of, and it continually gets upgraded as changes, like the one from 1 October. We've got a new version up there now. So if I can encourage you to use the electronic version, because you can do Control F, and there's an interactive one. But, for example, we're going to talk about the exceeding themes. It gives some examples in there. It gives some guidance. But at the meeting level, for each of the elements, it unpacks examples of what the authorised officer, and we carefully use the words may observe, may discuss, and may cite, because when we were writing those examples, we were really anxious and nervous that people would think that that was a checklist, and we did not think for 1 minute we would know the rich practice that was happening in services or evolving. It's amazing, our sector's leading in so many ways. When I talk to Reconciliation Australia, more than half of early childhood services across Australia have got a registered reconciliation plan, so much higher percentage than of the schooling sector. We're leading in so many different ways, and so it's not a checklist, but it does, I think, get you thinking about what the authorised officers are looking for and what was the intent behind that standard or that element, and thinking about genuinely and authentically what that looks like in your service. So that would be my key takeaway message, is that feel empowered. The assessment and rating process is an opportunity to showcase the great things that happen in your service every day, and don't be afraid to ask the questions. If you think that there's something being asked of you, But one of the challenges that we've had in the past is that, and I know myself, having worked in the sector, the practitioners that I've worked with, teachers and educators, some of amazing practitioners, we're not good at blowing our own trumpets, and we're not good at talking about the great things that happen. And so sometimes the authorised officer or the regulatory officer might do a prompt and question to try and, because they know good things are happening, but she or he has to have the evidence. So way back in the beginning, there were myths going around like, oh, you have to have a progressive morning tea to get the element relating to agency. And when you drill back, probably some authorised officer was trying to think about ways the service empowers children to have agency, and they probably said, oh, do you have progressive morning teas? And while that might work in some services, it might not work in another, and there might be a million reasons why it won't work in another. But there might be another million examples of how that service supports and challenges children to have agency and supports that. But unless you think about how you're going to demonstrate particularly some of those things like critical reflection or leadership, some of those things that are less tangible, it's really hard for the authorised officer or regulatory officer to do that. So that's a very long-winded, but thank you for that, because I'm sure that other people in the room were having the same sorts of questions. And we will unpack that in more detail as we go through the session, because it is the why and the how, and particularly some of those why questions. And when you've been working in a service for so long, but when you were talking about intentionality, you threw me back to 100 years ago when I worked in a regulatory authority and we were reviewing the legislation. And one of my colleagues, who didn't come from the sector, but had the best of intentions, and we were talking about the importance of a play-based approach, and not losing that focus on play as a mechanism for delivering quality experiences. And they said, well, if it's all about play, why do you need qualified staff? And of course, it's that intentionality that comes behind it. And I think, and also talking with families about explaining the program and the practice and the play-based approaches, identifying and highlighting that intentional thinking that goes behind is so important.
So that trainee that you have in your service, you can celebrate those working towards her certificate or his certificate 3, because that's part of that intentional teaching journey. And so it's about reframing how we're, looking to behave from the word go. Yeah. Yeah,
and just thinking about the critical reflection that happens every day. You might not necessarily document it, but you're thinking about, outcomes for children. You're thinking about changes in children's circumstances. You're thinking about, menus and a whole range of different things. And we're just going to unpack the difference between reflection and critical reflection, which comes up quite often. So we'll unpack that in a little more detail, and recognising, it's May, and it's already been a long year for everyone, for children, for families, and hopefully we can encourage you to think maybe about some of the processes that are currently in place, and is there some opportunities to reduce duplication or to streamline processes? Who's putting those expectations? Are they expectations that we're putting on ourselves? Because, I just think about those people that I worked with, and probably myself as well, just wanting to do the very best by children, but sometimes it's not sustainable and it takes its toll, and we don't want good educators and teachers leaving the sector.
Great. Thank you, Rhonda. So we digressed a little bit, but we just wanted to overview, just the definitions again of meeting the NQS and exceeding, and hopefully that will cover off. So service meets the national quality standards. Service provides quality education and care in all 7 quality areas. So the guide is written to meet the standards. Then we have the exceeding themes and the exceeding theme guidance in the guide, and that requires the service to go above and beyond what's expected at the meeting level. and it's the higher benchmark of quality. So we've got those regulative requirements and law, meeting and then exceeding. So in terms of gathering evidence, this is how it's potentially analysed. We have often these acronyms of EM, CR and ME in there within the standard. And what's important to remember here is that the service must be able to demonstrate all three themes within a standard before a standard can be rated at an exceeding level. And then if all standards within the quality area are determined as exceeding, then the whole quality area may be rated as exceeding. So to be rated exceeding overall, we must be meeting the NQS in 4 of those quality areas, and with at least 2 of them being in quality area 1, 5, 6 and 7. And again, all of that information is in the guide for you to talk about.
So that is assessed at the standard level?
Yes.
That's right, yeah.
Okay, so like I said, we have practices embedded in service operation, and this is multi-layered, or actually shaped by meaningful engagement. I'm just rushing through this one. But in terms of exceeding, we know that it's multi-layered and richly faceted, and that's what we're trying to achieve today. It's demonstrated consistently and frequently. It's interwoven through all aspects of the service, and it's visible in many forms. So when we talk about many forms, it could be a direct exceeding observation of practice, and others it may be something that needs to be unpacked a little more in discussions and citable evidence. It is linking practices to the NQS, and it's understanding the why in their practice. So fundamentally, all educators need to understand the exceeding themes and support that high quality practice in each standard, and how they contribute to that is based on their skills and knowledge and expertise. We're not expecting our trainees to be articulating their practice in the same way as your educational leader, for example. So it connects to the service philosophy. So Professor Jennifer Sumption, I thought, really threaded that in nicely in all aspects of the work. And it has a deep understanding of the pedagogy and the vision and of quality. So our philosophy is like those roots of the tree, and our practices and processes after that are the branches, and the outcomes are the leaves. You know, if you look at a tree analogy of where we're coming from, if we don't have those deep-rooted fundamental beliefs and have our backpacks on together with those beliefs, then that's why we reflect and review our service philosophies, because things change, families change, children's change, communities change. Look at our environmental impacts, for example, in a simple, not a simple, but a natural disaster. How does that change our world? So our philosophical perspectives might change in a heartbeat. And that says supporting high quality practice. So again, improving learning and developmental outcomes. So that's our aim. And so we have a lovely flowchart for you in your individual standard pack here. That is an FYI for you. And we really think that's, we've created that especially for South Australia's workshops, is a good opportunity for you to, as a starting point, unpack with and revisit with your teams, as an opportunity to do what we've just done in this quick overview this afternoon. So, yeah, the orange part looks at the meeting, and the blue part looks at the meeting, and the orange part looks at the exceeding. So it's a little bit hard to see on that slide, but generally speaking, it's another tool for you to use with your teams. So So I'm going to hand back over to
And-
Rhonda about gathering evidence.
Yes, and I have talked a little bit about the observe, discuss and cite as the three key ways that authorised officers will collect evidence. And of course we use different terminology, and communication can break down if there's a misunderstanding between the different terminologies. But the great thing about the guide and the approved learning frameworks is that they have a glossary of terms, and they have, you know, information about different theorists, but also lots of different terms that are used within the law, within the regulations, within the approved learning frameworks and the National Quality Standard. And of course, you know, the same word can mean different things to different people. So it's always, I think, helpful to go back to the guide when you're working as a service team to make sure that you're all on the same page in terms of that use of terminology, so that conversations aren't inhibited, but also thinking about those terms might help you unpack some of the practice and build confidence in being able to articulate when you're talking with families or talking with regulatory officers.
We were talking at the last session about how we just fill in the blanks at times with shared language. So there's an assumption of knowledge when we communicate with each other, and sometimes the receiver might be thinking, oh, well, they obviously mean that, and they fill in the blanks and go away and start to do what they think is what has been understood. So having a common process to say, okay, are we understanding? Are we keen to move forward with this behaviour, or what we understand as the concept of place-based pedagogy, for example, or a range of things, how we tidy the art and craft cupboard. You know, simple things like that. Are we sharing our language and we're sharing our understanding? Yeah. Sorry.
So
Rhonda.
in terms of the quality improvement plan, as you all know, there's the expectation that the quality improvement plan will be informed by a self-assessment. And we had that conversation early in the piece about, do we ask services to hand in their self-assessment? And we thought, no, we really want you to be open and honest, because that's a self-assessment for you and your service teams to inform your quality improvement plan. And thinking about the quality improvement plan, it should support processes that make visible the key practices that you do and what you're most proud of. It's about identifying strengths, not just areas for improvement. What are the jewels in your crown? What's unique to your service? And what are the practices that you couldn't be without? And that focus on continuous improvement, that's a key principle, guiding principle to the underpinning the whole National Quality Framework. It supports you to identify what practices may have been kept and what may have been discarded because they're no longer relevant. But it also helps to keep on track of new ways of working that result in better outcomes for children and families. But I think it also helps to build confidence for you and people in your team, and to make visible those. I always think about Malaguzzi and talking about documentation making children's learning visible. It helps to make visible those practices that enable you and your team to articulate and showcase the great things that are happening every day. And you will be, no doubt, familiar with those icons because they're all through the guide to the National Quality Framework. And the way we train authorised officers is that the main way to collect information is through that observation, because it helps to validate practices that you might have included in your quality improvement plan. It helps to reduce the burden. Some of you may remember, you're probably not many people as old as me, but the NCAC days when you might have had to have 7 folders and just trying to reduce that duplication, but also to give you the confidence to talk about the high quality practices that are being implemented consistently across the service, and to reduce that reliance on documentation. So there are some things that need to be observed. For example, relationships with children. It's hard to, clearly triangulating the evidence. We will have some rich conversations about relationships, but you're going to see the quality of those interactions through observations in the service. But then using those other methods like discussing, you have to discuss leadership, because the authorised officer, they've got limited time there in the service, and having those conversations about leadership or governance or some of those other aspects that might not necessarily be observed in a short visit is important, and also helps to build that holistic picture of service processes and delivery. And of course, they have to cite evidence. We know that documentation is really important in terms of tracking children's learning and development, in terms of sharing with families, in terms of conversations, collaboration between educators and service leaders, and thinking more broadly about documentation, thinking about the conversation about critical reflection. Is it that the staff meeting minutes might demonstrate how you've, as a team, critically reflected on some aspect of your program or practice, and it's resulted in a change, and that might be recorded in some staff meeting minutes. That it doesn't mean the regulatory authority or officer has to sift through staff meeting minutes, but you might use that as an example to show how your practice is continually improving. And it might be some newsletters, articles that you've shared with families. And as I said, there's examples in the guide for each of the 40 elements, but please, they're only suggestions. They're not prescriptive, and they're not exhaustive. So you might be able to add your own examples, and we would really encourage you to think about that, particularly if you are about to have an assessment and rating visit. And in terms of the assessment and rating report, again, authorised officers and regulatory officers are trained to use the evidence that they gather through observation, through discussion, and through citing the documentation. The reports are meant to be accurate, detailed, descriptive, contextual. They're meant to be well organised, relevant, and have factual information in them. You hopefully will note that there is a lack of emotive statements in assessment and rating reports. There might be some quality improvement notes, but again, it's about empowering you and your service, because you know your children and your families and your communities better than anyone else, and the way that you meet the standards needs to reflect your individual circumstances, but it needs to also be genuine and authentic for that setting. And we've had examples where some larger providers might have said, well, we've got the same policies and practices for all of our services, so all of our services should get the same rating for that element. But the reality is every service is different, every service team's different, things change. And so it's the role of the regulatory officer to look at those three ways of collecting evidence that you are meeting the standards. And we have a very strength-based approach to training those people who undertake those complex roles, because they are looking for examples of how you are meeting that standard. And isn't it a great way? Don't you think it's a great way to show how you are meeting the standards, and also how you are reflecting on your practice? I just think it's a positive thing. Initially, we thought that it potentially could limit some of that openness, but as time has moved on, many jurisdictions have moved to doing that self-assessment, because they see it as an opportunity to demonstrate that you've done the self-assessment and it's informed the quality improvement plan, but it also helps focus the questions that they ask at the service visit. Because we have heard from the sector, that sometimes they feel that it's really onerous, that they feel like they're being grilled for 5 hours. But can I speak from experience? It is a tough gig collecting evidence against 40 elements, 15 standards to make an informed decision about rating. So they are looking at ways to maximise the time that's spent in services and make sure that they're targeting the questions that they're asking. And I guess sometimes it is helpful to have different perspectives, because I know from my own experience of working in a service for a long time, you can tend to get into the groove, and sometimes it is helpful to have an outside perspective looking in. But I guess that's where it comes back. We're really hoping that as a result of today, that you feel empowered to ask the questions if you don't think, or if there's something you've missed. And that's why in the process, we built in the draft report that we can pick up the things that are potentially missed, or you may have thought of something afterwards in terms of a way to demonstrate meeting. So really take advantage of that draft.
The other thing I was thinking about with self-assessment is that version control of your self-assessment. A lot of us may get stuck into going back in the beginning and then this is what's happened, but really get into what's the here and now for us in our self-assessment, and you can have version control of that. So, and you might make decisions about when you're going to update that, and okay, well that's now, that goal has been achieved, that's embedded practice now, so therefore let's move on, it might need to become off. And you can keep those version controls of your self-assessment.
And I think those sort of assessments contribute to the critical reflection on services and assessing risks and determining whether it's an appropriate risk. That's all part of a self-assessment of your environment or the excursion that you want to take children on. So absolutely, yeah.
Empowering ourselves through self-assessments, not just those two documents.
That's right.
Yeah, but it's not prescribed.
It's the process.
Yeah, you're empowered to come up with some strategies that work for you. But I'd hate people to take away, oh, you have to do self-assessments on everything. But it's about empowering you to say, you know, this is one strategy that you might find helpful. And you made a really good point about the standards being, the themes being assessed at the standard level. So it's really important to remember that for the exceeding themes, it is at the standard level. But it's also really important to remember that quality is contextual. And each service is different, and the ways that you demonstrate how you exceed the National Quality Standard will look different. And we've got some great resources, but again, the risk is that people go, oh, well, if I do that, then in my service, then I'll be exceeding. But that's not the purpose of some of those resources, and we'll talk a little bit more about those. And also, to be rated at the exceeding level, they must be implemented. They can't be practices that you're planning to do, or they might be articulated in a policy, but they have to, but not yet implemented, they have to be seen to be implemented. And again, they must be above and beyond what's expected at the meeting level. And I think it is important to remember, as Kerry said, it is a high benchmark. And we just wanted to use this short animation to demonstrate how evidence might be collected when you're discussing quality practice with your regulatory officer. And as you listen, just take a moment to think about and identify what the regulatory officer might be seeking evidence to inform their decision making during that assessment and rating process. And this regulatory officer is Lucy, and she is conducting an assessment and rating visit at a large inner city outside school hours care program. And she's talking to the nominated supervisor, Erin, about their approach to transport safety. So even if your service is not an outside school hours care service, I think there's some some messages in terms of how the regulatory officer is gathering evidence that might fit across a number of different themes or even standards. Over to you, Lucy.
Go, Lucy.
We read in your quit that you use a bus to collect children from 5 local schools in the afternoons. You also referenced a transport framework. Could you please tell me about how that came about?
Yes, our afternoons are very busy getting all the children to the service using buses. Our transport framework came about in our review on transport processes when there was changes to transport requirements and a minor incident that we felt could be prevented in the future.
What are some of the processes you used as part of this?
We got together as a whole team after the incident to analyse our current procedure and identify any gaps we felt were missing from the process. We researched guidance by Kids and Traffic, the new transport legislation, and also contacted some other local OSH services who we know do multiple bus runs to see what their procedures are like. We also contacted the bus company we use to discuss how they could support us with information or training. This helped to form the basis of our transport framework.
How have the families been involved in this?
We asked the families what they thought about the current bus run, with many saying it was a high stress point for them in using OSH. When we discussed our potential changes and introduced the transport framework, they were very keen to be involved. So we held an information session and got some excellent feedback on how to make even more improvements.
What about the children?
When we held meetings with the children, they told us they find the bus run to be too long because they are hungry and want to get to OSH to play with their friends. This had us go back to our strategies and consider how we could shorten this transition for the children.
Thanks for sharing that information about the transport framework. Can you please tell me what has been implemented as part of this review?
We had a series of team meetings to discuss all the information and research. We debated several potential strategies, identifying the benefits and risks to each one, and then used this to make some changes to our policy and procedures. Some of the things we changed was adding a compulsory daily briefing that all staff attend at the beginning of their shift, which covers things like how many children are attending from each school, any children who have allergies, and which children are absent. Oh, and we also changed the bus route to make it shorter based on the feedback by the children, so now children are on the bus no longer than 15 minutes, and they have shared with us that they are really glad we listened to them and shortened the trip.
Okay. Not that one. That's a special treat from the AO training, actually.
Yeah. So in terms of that, what you saw Lucy doing, we should do more of these animations, though. I'll take that back to our team, because they are great, aren't they, in terms of unpacking some of that. But you can see she was starting to make some of the connections with the exceeding themes, and she was also taking lots of notes about things that she wanted to follow up further questions about. As part of the training process, we really do train authorised or regulatory officers to take clear and concise notes so that they're analysing all the evidence collected, and they're doing that at a later time because, again, they go back to the guide. We don't want them making decisions that aren't reflective of the guide or going on gut feelings about, oh yeah, this feels like it's a good practice. We want them to go back to the guide. So you can see that the exceeding themes begin to emerge at this analytical stage. And I think when thinking about and gathering evidence in your service and as part of that self-assessment process, I think it's really helpful to consider how you measure practices in your service or practices that your services are demonstrating, because we can think that practices are high quality, and when we check the guide, we actually find they're meeting because it is a high benchmark. But conversely, there might be times when you think, oh, we're meeting, but when you look at the guidance, it's actually practice that exceeds the national quality standard. I think it's also important to consider, does the high quality practice support the overall intent of the standard. So it goes back to your point about it's not at the element level, it's at the higher standard level. So becoming familiar with that standard descriptor, the overview of the exceeding model, the exceeding guidance in the Guide to the National Quality Framework will help to consolidate and to confirm your thinking in that respect. But I also think it's important to consider, does it demonstrate the exceeding theme or themes? And the exceeding questions, if you haven't had a look at the exceeding questions in the Guide to the National Quality Standard, please do so, because they're the questions that the regulatory officer, once they've gathered all of the evidence, they will go back and they will work through those questions. And we've included those questions in your pack. And we would really encourage you to use those questions. Again, it's empowering because they're in the Exceeding NQS Theme Guidance section of the Guide to the National Quality Standard. And as a team sitting around working through those questions will help you identify practice that is exceeding. And it's also a really valuable resource, I think, to cross-reference when you're working with your service teams. And so I think it's also important to remember that to be exceeding in any standard, all three themes must be evident in the standard. And I mentioned we've got some resources on our webpage that you can download. They're all for free. The Guide to the National Quality Standard, I can't promote it enough because, as I said, I think a strength of the framework is that it's transparent. The authorised officers use exactly the same information as is used by the sector in terms of the guide. It's a great reference point.
Can I just jump in there, Rhonda, about when you do, rather than downloading to your desktop, it's only as good as that point in time. So you're better off to add it as a favourite. And then as you go, you're definitely going into the most current version of what's on. As Rhonda said before, there's always overviews going on and key upgrades to words and spaces within that guide.
I love it because you can do Control F and it's so much easier to use the electronic version. And as I said, if you feel like you need to read it cover to cover, you really do need to think about getting out more. It is a big document, but it's a really helpful document. And also in that guide, there's a page around the exceeding theme guidance, and it includes those questions that the regulatory officers will be asking in terms of establishing that practice. And it does build that transparency in terms of identifying practice that's exceeding and remembering that this came about because the sector asked for more guidance and more consistency about the exceeding practice. It also includes a bit of an overview for each standard that unpacks the intent and the purpose of the standard. And that's especially important when determining if the potential high quality practice relates to an overall standard. And you can use this section to understand if the high quality practice is applicable to the intent of the whole standard. So there's lots of guidance there to help you to understand what exceeding might look like in practice for each of the standards, but it's also there to support you in your self-assessment processes. We've also got on the website some really great case studies, and there are a series of case studies, one for centre-based services, one for family daycare services, and one for outside school hours care services. And again, these are real-life examples that are drawn together in a case study. But again, if I can just really emphasise that just by following or doing some of the things in that case study does not necessarily make your service exceeding, because every service is different and it needs to be embedded and genuine and authentic to that particular service. But just recently we did some work with some area managers and some regional managers of different service providers, and one of the leaders came to me after the session and she said, we just had our assessment and rating, we were sure we were exceeding and we were so devastated when we didn't get exceeding. But she said, now going through this case study, I can understand that we weren't actually exceeding, but I can understand why we weren't exceeding. So again, they're a great resource to unpack. They've been shared nationally. All lead assessors have looked at them as well in terms of setting the consistent benchmark in the way they assess and rate, and authorised officers use those. So I'd really encourage you, if you haven't already joined up to our newsletter, we've got lots of blogs on the newsletter, on the website, and lots of newsletter articles that relate to exceeding and services telling their stories about practice that is exceeding. Because what we've learnt over the years is that services love to hear other, educators love to hear other educators' stories, service leaders love to hear other service leaders' stories. So we would really encourage you to share your stories with us so that we can share it more broadly, and it's an opportunity to acknowledge, recognise and celebrate the good practice that happens in your sector. But because we love a game, don't we, in early childhood? We want to make, there is such a lot of information to get through. We have made a Quest for Quality game, similar to Trivial Pursuit, but no IP issues, because it's very different. This one's about the National Quality Standard, and in particular, this game is about the exceeding themes, and it's a great way, I think, to unpack what the themes are at a staff meeting or a team meeting in a fun way. I've tried to take it away with me on holidays, for weekends away. I struggle to get people to want to play. I don't understand why, because it's fun. Again, it's downloadable for free on the website.
Again, that goes back to that shared knowledge, shared behaviour. We all understand what we're talking about in a really engaging way. Yeah.
And I know that we've done a lot of talking and you've done a lot of sitting, and it's late in the afternoon. So we could, if you like, have a short break for a stretch and, maybe to meet someone else in the group, or we can have a little bit of a longer break, maybe a 5-minute stretch break and finish earlier. Or if you would like, we can have a longer break, a 20-minute break, and there's a coffee shop downstairs if you wanted to go and have a coffee. But what do you think? A shorter break? Just enough time to stretch, go to the bathroom? Okay, shorter break, and we'll talk really fast so that we can get you out earlier, because we know that you've probably already had a very long day.
Thanks for coming back. And we're just going to get active in this second half. So we have a few folders and things for some group activities and some individual reflections in your own spaces as well in those information resource booklets. So we're going to look now at each exceeding theme and delve a little bit deeper on what they mean and why they're important. So theme 1, practice is embedded in service operations. So it's important to look at the wording of this theme itself and consider what is embedded, what does service operations imply, why is it important, and how does this look in practice. So we're just going to go to the first activity 1 in your individual booklets, the one with the purple thing, and I want you to take just a few minutes. We've got some lovely highlighters there, or you can underline whatever you feel the need, to read through that content and circle or underline any keywords or highlight any keywords that stand out for you to help you understand what exceeding theme 1 is saying. So these are the indicators of exceeding theme 1. So I'll just give you a couple of minutes to do that. Okay, that's just a 2 to 3 minute little activity, and that's something that could be simply done as part of a staff meeting at the beginning, or when you're focusing on that particular agenda item, to say, okay, this is my understanding, but let's talk about everybody's understanding of what jumped out at them as important. So let's have a look at what we're saying here in relation to when practice is embedded in service operations. This means that high quality practice is the usual, practice for this standard. So high quality is embedded when it occurs consistently and frequently, and intentionality, as we've spoken about already, as part of the ongoing process. So embedded practice has a clear intent. So again, we're talking about intentionality, of a deep understanding of the why and how we do things day to day. And it usually has high quality, thoughtful and intentionality behind the practice or that behaviour. And it's understood and implemented by all. We must see that those pockets of rooms that are doing wonderful things, and there might be another room or space that may not be doing that. We're only good as as a coach, we always say we're only good as that person that we need to support the most. So how are we supporting all and reaching all, and why is it that they may not be potentially understanding? So we might need to go back a step and think about our fundamentals of communication, trust, support. So then when we talk about, did you highlight service operations as a potential key indicator? So it must be reflected through many aspects of the organisation and visible in many forms. So this slide shows you the range of ways in which you can reflect service operations and systems that could be visible in many forms. So depending on the quality area, for example, and the high quality practice itself, you can see that there might be evidence in routines or relationships or documentation, depending on what the focus is. And that's up to you about bringing that out to show us that, not show me, but show your regulatory officer and your children, your families, whoever you're articulating to, where that sits best. Where is the window in to make that practice shine to the best of your ability as a group. So why is it important? It's important when there is a whole team approach with a shared sense of understanding and purpose and agency within yourselves. So this underlying consistency and intent creates a stable and high quality care and education environment. It feels good when you're walking in knowing that you're doing the do well, doesn't it? When there's a rhythm. And it does establish a sense of continuity, predictability and security for each child. It ensures that practices of high quality are thoughtful and intentional while being responsive. So yes, we're saying yes, there's continuity and consistency, but there is also the ability to change it up when necessary. So the rain, someone's sick, it means that we can step in and keep going with a shared understanding of what is going on rather than a chaotic approach to practice. So that everyday flow of events is always open to change, isn't it? But it is an understood change. And it provides a basis for ongoing discussions about practice and continuous improvement. So definitely when people feel that there's an embedded practice and a sense of an exceeding theme of behaviours, then people are more willing to have a conversation about change because it's a cultural expectation. I'm just going to close this door. Getting a bit rowdy out there. Yeah. So again, how can we demonstrate these high quality practices? High quality practices in theme 1 are above and beyond meeting the reflective part of that standard, and we have spoken about that before. There's discussions with there might be sample educators, the educational leader, the nominated supervisor, depending on what is being asked, and ongoing processes that are understood and implemented by all. And the service might show or cite documentary evidence reflective of this practice as well. So this may help assist in the determination of between meeting and exceeding. But embedded, we can say, is probably the most observable part of an authorised officer's visit. So if you are seeing, our recommendation to you is if you are seeing an inconsistency in embedded practice, that your peers are your allies in support. So if it's a bit like conflict resolution, you go to the source first, have a conversation where there is a trustful, respectful conversation about, can you tell me about how you've come about to do blah? And then, is it connecting with the philosophy? Is it an understood and shared approach? And why potentially is it sitting outside what has been agreed? So yeah, definitely those everyday conversations can be preventable to being maybe a staff meeting minutes or a performance review at the end of somebody's journey. We want to build capacity in our teams, like I said, and ensure that we are all on the same page. So we all have that accountability to be engaging with behaviours that are consistent in that respect. Yeah, so that's just an overview of practice being embedded in the service operations. And we're going to do now a activity about that as a group. So in your little yellow envelopes, some of you have 2, some of you have 1. If you have 1, you might need just to crouch up a little bit. So we have, we're going to move to a case study that's looking at standard 3.2 use. And we've chosen to focus on environmentally responsible component of this standard. And obviously environmental sustainability now encompasses an upgrade, well not an upgrade, a review of what our definition of sustainability looks like. It's not just the natural environment, recycling, waste. It's now social, economic, as we know in our EYLFs and MTOPs, that we are now talking much more diversification of the concept of sustainability. So what does that look like from an embedded perspective in the day-to-day behaviours of your teams and children and families? This is an example. So what I want you to do is look at, in that case study, I'll give you 5 minutes, to look at that with an embedded lens. What's jumping out, what paragraphs of that case study are jumping out to say, this is embedded practice. So you can highlight them as a team. That's fine. And we'll come back together to discuss exceeding theme 1, embedded practice is embedded in service operations. Just for your information, this is on our website. This is one of the case studies that we were talking about. So don't panic if I haven't read it all, but just in the interest of time and keeping us to task. So some of the, let's just see how you went. Yeah, great. So an example of exceeding theme in this case study, looking from an embedded into service operations, was the paragraph about the community which it was situated. That was one space, and about their auditing process, and that gave the service a better understanding of the type of waste being produced to then inform the development of their policy and waste reduction. And then it went on to, this has also influenced their purchasing policy. So again, when we were talking about extending our definition of sustainable practices and showing that they are embedding economic and social components of sustainable practices, you can see that this is showing that they have determined items that are a sustainable option when purchased and where possible from local companies. And their menus have also been reviewed to ensure that their items are used are seasonal, okay, and sustainably sourced. And another exceeding theme was the paragraph starting, whilst a strong aspect of the service philosophy is on rethinking the purchase of and use of items. Better put my glasses on. The service also aims to ensure that items can be repurposed or recycled as possible. So they're just a couple of examples in that case study that show that exceeding theme coming through. So over to you, Rhonda.
So the second theme is one that we get lots of questions about. Practice is informed by critical reflection. And we get lots of questions because ever since the implementation of the National Quality Framework, critical reflection has been one of the elements that's been most challenging to meet, and also we get questions about the link between the element and the theme for the exceeding. So just thinking about critical reflection and the difference between the two. So whilst critical reflection is the concept in 1.3.2, it's important to understand that that really relates to supporting children's learning and development and not in relation to the theme, because the theme relates across all of the standards. So exceeding theme 2 is applied to all of the standards within the NQS. And as the services engage with critical reflection throughout the NQS and element 1.3.2, in order to meet the exceeding theme, it has to be at the standard 1.3 level. Because remember, it's not at the element level, it's at the standard level. And there would need to be some careful reflection and connection to the intent of standard 1.3 as a whole. Does that make sense? So it's at the standard level, not the element level. So element 1.3.2 is really focusing on children's learning and development, and this is much broader. So let's have a look. Let's dig deeper into theme 2, and critical reflection really means continually thinking about, questioning, analysing and re-evaluating practice to identify where further improvements could be made. It's a deeper level, it's regular, it's ongoing thinking that goes beyond simple evaluation and review. And it occurs when decision making draws on diverse perspectives, such as theoretical underpinnings, various sources of knowledge, or different viewpoints. And it can result in robust debate, as Jennifer Sumption talked about, amongst the team members, and it's also about using this to inform decision making. So, the theme relates to practices and in a particular standard being informed by critical reflection to either improve or solidify the reasoning behind current practices for the particular standard. So it can relate to any standard within the National Quality Standard. And at the exceeding National Quality Standard level, members of the service team should be engaging in ongoing critical reflection as appropriate for their role and responsibilities, as Vanessa talked about before. And so asking questions like the why and the how questions. Why do we do this practice? Why in this way? Who's advantaged and who's disadvantaged? That's one of my favourite questions in the approved learning frameworks. How does the practice contribute to the best outcomes for all? How does the practice include Or does the practice include any stereotyping or bias or inequity? Does the practice need to change? And lastly, how can we improve this practice? So by reflecting on those answers and along with the theoretical perspectives that underpin the actions and drawing on those various sources of knowledge, it gives you some opportunities to look beyond and think about the rationale behind the ideas and practices to identify if they fit with the context of the service and your service philosophy before informing practice decisions. So, thinking about the other part of that, that theme, informs service practice, that's a really important part of the theme as well, because many service teams may participate in critical reflection, yet there might not be any indication of that, or team members may not be able to demonstrate that they've used that critical reflection to either confirm current practice or inform changes that might have been made to service operations. So it's important to note that through critical reflection, you can deliver continuous quality improvements, but it doesn't always have to result in a change in practice. You may be critically reflecting on an existing practice which confirms that this is the most appropriate program or process or action for your service to be engaged in. So you might make an informed decision that it doesn't need to change. Or you might explore ways that that could be improved. And I guess it's important that critical reflection is valued by the whole service team. And if that happens, people are more likely to feel comfortable raising ideas and suggestions and concerns. They might feel more comfortable to ask the difficult questions or to challenge the way things have always been done or that they're currently being done. And it might result in better outcomes for all. And it comes with an ability to look within yourselves as individuals and as service teams and really connect with the emotional intelligence of the group. Educators will then be confident in knowing the why behind service decisions and the why behind their own practices, and also more likely to be responsive to the changing needs of the service community in meaningful ways which enable them to be proactive to feedback and not reactive to it. And, of course, an important aspect of critical reflection is your ability to honestly reflect on your current practice and determine what needs to be refined, improved, changed, or left the same to ensure the high quality outcomes for children and families and communities, and also your educators as well. And when you think back to those methods of collecting evidence, critical reflection is often collected through the rich discussions that you have with regulatory officers. You might want to discuss some current practices or changes that you've made in your practices and processes, and also, articulating why you might have chosen to keep something the same. But it's not sufficient to critically reflect on a practice and not make a change or verify why a change hasn't been made. So thinking about critical reflection, thinking about what you might want the regulatory officer to observe. What do you want to discuss with them? And what documentation or documents might you want to share to demonstrate that you have been critically reflecting on practices? And we're just going to move to another activity looking at... So we're just going to move into another activity?
Yes, so this activity is activity number 4 in your pack, and it has 3 examples of, this is about informing practice. So I just want you to identify, there's three examples, but we've realised that we've duplicated the third one. So we're just going to look at the 2, the first example 1 and example 2. And I just want you to see whether or not that particular example is informing the services practice, or is it not informing the service practice. So I'll just give you a couple of minutes just to have a look at that. So just coming back, hopefully that you've come up with the same decisions as us in these examples. So for example 1, critical reflection is demonstrated in the referencing of the theorists and utilising the OT to gain information from outside of the service. It has identified an improvement, however, improvement has not been implemented as yet, so therefore it has not yet informed service practice. So we would hope that in the future that would become embedded. Then example 2, critical reflection is demonstrated by consideration of social justice and hypothesising different approaches, and this critical reflection has informed service practice in that the service has changed the way they celebrate children's birthdays as a result. So usually it's something, as a result, this has happened. It'd be a nice mantra for your teams as well. I'll just jump by example 3 because we didn't put it in. And I'd just like to talk to you now. I'll just show this quick video to revisit what Jennifer Sumption and said about critical reflection in relation to our first video, that sometimes it's not a comfortable process. This is Sarah Gibson, who talks about the 5 behaviours of a cohesive team. And a cohesive team has trust and respect as the base in order to create space for robust discussions. And so we think this really sits well with this particular exceeding theme. So we'll just take a moment to have a look at what Sarah says and get your thoughts and ideas.
Excellent. We are here together. We're going to be talking about the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team. So how many of you out there have heard of the 5 dysfunctions of a team? All right, lots of hands out there. It's a really famous book written by Patrick Lencioni. Patrick Lencioni partnered with Wiley, and they created this new program, and it's called the 5 Cohesive Behaviors of a Team. And it marries DISC and the 5 dysfunctions, and it talks from a team perspective and evaluates how do I become more effective at building teams. So you'll notice that we've got the model up here. It is a pyramid. It's designed so that each team really focuses first on trust. It's a baseline. We have to have trust in a team in order to be effective. And most of us have been part of teams where there's been no trust, and we know how painful that can be. So if you don't have solid trust, you can't go farther up and be more effective as a team. The next level is conflict. If I don't trust somebody, I'm not going to have healthy conflict with them. So I've got a young woman named Alex on my team, and if she doesn't trust me, she's not going to come back and say, Sarah, that was a really bad idea, or actually, that doesn't work so well for me. We need to have healthy trust in order to have conflict that produces healthy results. From there, we go to the next level, which is commitment. Within the commitment piece, we know that in order to get people to buy in and to have clarity of what we're looking for, we really need to have healthy conflict. Because if we don't have the conflict, we don't get people to buy in. We don't get people to weigh in, and we're not clear on where we're going. So nobody commits. So if you've ever been in a meeting, and then like 2 weeks later, that whole meeting happens again, and you're like, didn't we talk about this? I thought we resolved this. It's because you didn't have enough trust to have healthy conflict to then commit to that process. The next step is really this accountability piece. So how do I hold others accountable? But it's really about peer-to-peer accountability. If we all agree, if we all commit to our mission, our vision, our values, then we can hold one another accountable in that process. And it's not that the manager doesn't have a role, doesn't have any accountability responsibilities. He does, or she does, but the reality is peer-to-peer accountability is most effective. And from there, once you've got everybody accountable, committed, you've had healthy conflict, you've got solid trust, results is the next piece. You're going to be productive, you're going to reach bottom line pieces, you're going to reach goals as an organization. Those are all parts to this. We all know of teams that get results, but they have this really dysfunctional environment. And the reality is they actually succeed in spite of themselves, because you might get some results, but if everything else is broken in your pyramid and all of the other cohesive behaviors don't exist, they're not repeatable results. So sometimes people think they're doing fine because they're getting good results, but that's not really the true measurement of a successful team. A successful team has these 5 cohesive behaviors. So that's what we're going to be talking about as we look at these components. How do we get to the heart of each of these levels within this team right here?
Okay.
That healthy conflict kind of aligns beautifully with the conversation about critical reflection and having those healthy discussions in safe places. And I just wanted to reiterate the difference between reflection, when it's often recalling events or reflecting back on what happened during an experience or a situation, and then on the other hand, critical reflection is that deeper examination of not only what happened, but why. And by deconstructing it or pulling it apart, it gives the opportunity to critically examine each aspect and gives educators and services the opportunity to gather information to guide decision making and make decisions about whether to continue with a practice or a program or what might be changed. And using it to inform practice, I guess, is a key component of that. And the next level of critical reflection to consider in relation to exceeding theme 2, in this case, we'd follow the steps that we discussed earlier about ensuring that critical reflection relates to your practices and supports the intent of the whole standard. So going back to that standard level. So just in summarising, critical reflection might be undertaken individually, but it might be undertaken as part of a team endeavour. It includes that robust debate that we've been talking about as a group. It's about gaining multiple perspectives, and that robust debate is a strong or healthy discussion on a subject where varying views might be considered, and thinking about social justice implications, what's working, what needs to be improved, who's it going to impact on. Referencing theorists or current research or information. Could be information from outside the service that supports educators having that awareness of different theoretical perspectives and how these might influence practices. But it also involves asking those regular questions to better understand why things happen in a certain way and how it might inform future planning and practices, and also thinking about responding to complex situations and challenges that might arise. It can involve testing and hypothesising different approaches and determining where there are clear links with the service practice. So, exceeding theme 3.
Yes, here we are at our end of the day, our last theme. Practice is shaped by meaningful engagement with families and or the community. And the final theme is shaped how we explore who is families and or the community, what is meaningful engagement, how can it shape practice, why is it important, and how does this look like in practice. And again, activity 5 in your individual book has the key indicators for that, which you can highlight. We jumped along a little bit with the quality area 2, but you could do that for your homework. It's the same sort of idea that we were hoping that you would get to do as part of your ongoing work with your teams. So we see that Theme 3's assessment indicators and unpacking them, that you would hope that meaningful engagement would jump out as a very, by definition, having a function or purpose that is clear, significant or useful. So it has to result in something. So meaningful engagement is when it recognises values and seeks perspectives, and from that it can be from children, families or community. It goes beyond participation in service events or informing your families and communities about practice. And it also is actively seeking the insight and expertise of families and or the community. So services which are seen as meaningfully engaging with their families and or community see this engagement as fundamental to developing responsive, reciprocal and ongoing relationships. We talk about co-construction of knowledge with our children. This is the same look and feel. We want it to be a true testament of what we're asking of our families and children and community. So, it also recognises each service as a unique context that is shaped by its families, community and location. So again, place-based pedagogy really comes into play here. So diversities in factors such as language, cultural identity, child rearing practices, values and belief systems contribute to the uniqueness and complexity of each service. And it's important to be mindful of these key words. So I want to bring you to your attention at this point in time that there is an and an or, and it's not a requirement that each practice considered within this theme has meaningful engagement with families and community. It could be seen as a meaningful engagement with families or the community, or a mix of both, depending on what you're seeing is bringing out and the cream coming to the top in your evidence. It's important to note that the community can be also inclusive of the children in your service and the community of your attending families, the local community, local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and other diverse communities or wider community members. Okay, so this brings us to the key word of shaped. So again, quite like theme 2, where critical reflection informs practice and service operations. Here it is expected that the meaningful engagement has led to you to reflect on the feedback that has been sought, information or guidance, and then used to shape the current practice that you have or make changes. And so during an assessment and rating visit, it's important to demonstrate examples of how your practices have shaped, formed, changed or influenced as a result of these meaningful engagements from families, children or the community. So again, remember they're implemented practices. So often questions between meeting and exceeding happen here as well. So we know that at a meeting level, services should provide opportunities for families to participate and engage with the service. There is also the expectations that families will be informed of service practices to build collaborative partnerships, but at an exceeding level, we're saying that we're actively seeking that input. And so it's a ground up perspective, isn't it? It's not a top down. So the guidance and feedback from children and the community is shifting potential thinking that you may already have, or shaping ongoing practice and changing and fostering that culture of inclusiveness and that sense of belonging for all. So that real bottom up approach. So yes, we're saying that when practices are shaped by meaningful engagement with families, children and or the community, it supports the service to reflect, utilise and build on those unique strengths that really showcases when those families have that meaningful engagement and the community is involved in shaping your practices. It provides opportunities for the service to actively build and maintain those relationships with families and community partners. And it ensures that opportunities are regularly provided for shared decision making and problem solving. So it's not just the surveys that go out and the one-off, it is genuinely shared at all times. We're using good strategies that suit and support the unique environmental context of the location. And there is that true sense of belonging for all. And the voices of children are valued and considered in this exceeding theme and standards.
And just like the previous theme, one of the main ways of gathering evidence is having those rich conversations and discussions with the regulatory officer, and also then thinking about what you want them to cite in terms of documentation and what you want them to observe as part of their process of collecting information. And just in terms of summarising, I just wanted to pull together some of the key points in terms of this theme.
Sorry, I'm going forward. Yep, there we go.
So I'll just give you a minute to read that summary. So the engagement has led to or shaped practice at the service, and it may appear complex, and it does require a whole team approach to practice and continual improvement, and it can't just appear. It's just going back to what Jennifer said about it takes time and patience. It takes time to evolve and to become established practice throughout your service. And we've got one last, I promise it's the very last activity because it's late in the day, but just one last activity to further look at that theme.
Yep, so if you look at activity 6, I want you to now look at this activity with a meaningful engagement lens. So some of you would have the same case study and some of you might have 4.1. So it should say activity 6. Okay, everybody, I know that we're really powering along here, but hopefully as you read that case study, you're starting to pull out those meaningful connections. And some of the examples that have been out of that OSH example was that the coordinator took the team feedback to the school principal. It was decided that a family forum would be held to gather feedback. So there was an action out of that. Our other families expressed concern with the number of staff their children needed to know across the week and mentioned their kindergarten children are missing their educators from the on-site preschool. A family also suggested for younger children more consistency with educators. From this, these families were invited to join the family planning meeting. So simple. But I'm hoping that you're hearing how you can articulate your practice in your writing and your report writing in this experience as well. So at the planning meeting, the family representative, school principal and service team discussed the available options. Principal also suggested recruiting some of the early childhood qualified educators form on the on-site preschool and assign these educators to the additional room, as many of the younger children were transitioning from the preschool, and this would ensure educators are organised in a way to support continuity. And the OSH hired preschool educators seeking additional work to join the existing educators with early childhood backgrounds in working with the younger cohort. The service coordinator also made sure they had additional staff rostered in the junior area at drop-off and pick-up time, so they could be available to speak with families and children wanting to ask questions, have further discussions or needed support. So again, that embedded practice comes through. And at the monthly family planning meetings, the service coordinator and principal shared their observations about the impact of the new arrangement, and further consultations with children and families will follow to ensure that this practice continues to meet the needs for children and families. So
I'd really encourage you, if you haven't had a chance to have a look at those case studies, you might choose ones that relate to the areas that you want to focus on and also the service type that you're working in. And they're all available on our website. And both the ESB and ASEQA are really cognizant about opportunities to reduce duplication. We've got some ideas to take back to Kerry and her team, but when I think about it, there seems to be two areas that there are potentially a lot of opportunities to streamline or reduce duplication. One is the quality improvement plan, and I guess from my experience, having looked at and worked on quality improvement plans, having a focused approach and identifying what are the priorities, you're much more likely to be successful if you focus on those priorities rather than trying to do all 15 standards and 40 elements. But pick off which ones are the highest priority. And if you're doing quality improvement for, if you're part of a larger organisation and you're involved in other quality assurance processes, think about ways that you might like to streamline it. There is no template. There's one on the ASEQA website, but of course that's just a suggestion. There's opportunities, as long as you cover those areas, to develop resources or supports or templates that best meet your needs, and thinking about those opportunities to reduce duplication. And the other one, and we touched on it a little bit earlier, is documentation. And as much as we keep saying, you know, there's flexibility in the regulations and the national quality standards, it is outcome focused. There isn't a recipe in terms of, oh, you need 5 observations or learning stories, or you have to do it this way, or you have to have a reflective diary. It is about empowering you to come up with strategies that enable you to meet the standards in a way that's relevant for your service context. And, you know, maybe going back to the basics in terms of what the regs are asking for, what the national quality standards are asking for, and making sure that the documentation that you're using is actually helping you undertake the role in supporting children's learning and development and making their learning visible to families, to others like your regulatory officer. And I think sometimes, you know, I've said it before, that as early childhood practitioners, we want the best for children, and sometimes we put expectations on ourselves that are sometimes even not sustainable. If they're burning us out and, you know, people are leaving our sector because they feel that they're overwhelmed with the burden of documentation, is there an easier way to do it? Going back to those basics and looking at opportunities to reduce duplication, but making sure that you're actually capturing what's meaningful and what's helpful in terms of, you know, meeting the building in the planning cycle. And we've just been doing some work with the Independent Education Union to try and go back to basics and look at what is required and empowering you to make decisions about how you meet those standards and looking at opportunities to reduce that unnecessary burden. So we've got a bit of a draft fact sheet, and it is draft. We're working with our lead assessors across Australia and others, but if you are interested, I'm happy to share a copy and keen to get your feedback about that. Because I do think that taking a step back, and we're having lots of conversations in the national context about the use of digital devices in capturing children's photos, and whilst they can be a great way of capturing learning, it's not without its risks, and thinking about the purpose of it. Is it just to capture some happy snaps, or is it a marketing tool, or is it actually telling a story? And how are those being shared? Are children's privacy, are those issues being considered? And if you're using AI, and there's some great opportunities to streamline processes in using AI, but it doesn't come without its risks, and thinking about, you know, what happens to those digital images and who's got access to those images if you're using some of those free platforms. So that's some of the thinking that we've been doing, but we'd love if you have some views or some thoughts that you'd like to share. We'd really be keen to hear it. And I just wanted to take this opportunity to get you to think about the strategies that you're currently using in terms of quality improvement and in documenting children's learning and your programs, to think about how you can meet the legislative standards, how you can meet or reflect the approved learning frameworks, but also how your documentation and quality improvement planning is meaningful and authentic for your service context. But also think about it in terms of sustainability, because the last thing we want is good educators and teachers like yourselves to be leaving our sector. So I just wanted to finish by saying, on behalf of the ESB, and Kerry had to leave, but on behalf of the ESB and ASIQA, we just wanted to take an opportunity to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. And we also wanted to say thank you, because what a great group you've been. You've been open and honest in sharing your thoughts and ideas. We've got some things to take back to further conversations, but it was really lovely to hear your generosity in sharing at the table discussion. So a heartfelt thank you from Kristen, Vanessa and I, and Kerry as well. And we hope that it's been helpful. Please, if I've got one key message, it's have a look at the guide to the National Quality Framework and unpack that in terms of building that shared understanding of expectations around the exceeding themes, as well as the other resources that are available to help you in your important roles. So thank you. Thank you.